Our Week 1 summary of the Vietnam War includes the information of the totality of French colonization. And in French colonization of what they called Indochina and what we call now Vietnam is clearly a period in which the Vietnamese learned how to deal with the issue of colonization or imperialism when they get to their relationship with the United States, if you can call it such. So for this particular summary, there are quite a few issues that I want you to be able to focus on. So as we go through each of the slides, make sure that you're picking up the basics in terms of the information, and then our very last slide, I'm going to give you your summary list, and these are the things that I really want you to be able to explain and understand once you are finished with this portion of the course. And as you've seen, this is jam-packed in terms of Week 1. And there's a great deal of information here that I'm sure that many of you have never even heard before. So in terms of understanding French colonization, let's move along and let's look at some of the major highlights here. Not just highlights, but major highlights of packing all of this material together and then somewhat unpacking it for you. Well, French colonization of Indochina really starts as any other Western colonization throughout the world, and that's with traders and with missionaries. And this is a period of time in the 1600s when the French are really starting to create colonies for themselves and will create really a vast empire eventually. But when they first have contact with what they called Indochina, they really did not, they really were not that successful initially. And they weren't successful in being able to, at least in this period, establish good economic ties, and they weren't able to, at least in this period, establish any sort of religious relationship with the Vietnamese. Eventually this will change in terms of certainly economics, but also in terms of religion. And what we will see is that, particularly in the south of Vietnam, where most of the Westerners were centralized, you will see that Catholicism will pick up in the South, and there will be a great number of Vietnamese in the South who will be Catholic. So we're going to see this develop over a long period of time. But note that at the beginning of French colonization, there was very little success in Indochina. Now that perks up with the Industrial Revolution, and with the Industrial Revolution obviously comes the idea that the French would need natural resources to then take home and to sell and also to use in terms of production, right? The Americans are eventually going to get into this, particularly in terms of rubber and the rubber trees and the rubber plants in Vietnam. And rubber and the economics of the United States relationship and then conflict with Vietnam cannot be overstated. I don't think we talk about that enough, and we'll fast forward to that in a little bit. But recognize the fact that Indochina and Southeast Asia as a whole for the French was going to become very lucrative in terms of natural resources, and that's something that the Americans are going to pick up on, and the United States is going to use and also see it as a prime reason to remain in the region and to have some sort of Western influence over the region. It's not just about the Cold War, right? But in terms of this particular period, note the fact that the French are going to colonize this area over a period of time. So we have the 1600s here all the way up to what's hiding under the map there, 1885. It's about in the 1850s when the French start to kind of pick at Indochina and take this place and take that place and start building these colonies for themselves. But by 1885, that is a full takeover of that region that they call Indochina. And they create 3 separate colonies. They could create Cochin China, they create Annam, and they create Tonkin. And Tonkin's obviously right off of the Gulf of Tonkin, which we'll be talking about considerably during the U.S. conflict in Vietnam. But the one I want you to focus on here is Cochin Cochin China, because when we fast forward and we go to the end of the First Indochina War, it's going to be the issue of Cochin China that is going to be a sticking point for Ho Chi Minh, because the French do not want to relinquish that. And to Ho Chi Minh, it is, you absolutely must give that to us, or else we will fight you. And obviously this is the way that the First Indochina War really ramps up. So keep that in mind in terms of Cochin China, that's a very important spot. And note the fact that one of the reasons why it's an important spot for the French is that's where they're centralized, but it's going to also become, obviously it's the South, so it's going to become the hotbed in terms of collaboration with the French, and then also collaboration with the United States. Okay, so that's a major reason why you would want to understand what Cochin China is, why it's so important to the North, why it's so important to the Westerners, and why it's so important to the people of South Vietnam. And it's within this Cochin China area, the south of Vietnam, that we'll also see the rise of the Viet Cong during the American conflict with Vietnam. So again, a really, really important area in terms of not only French colonization, but also the entirety of what we'll be talking about in this particular course. Now, as you have read in the Carnell book, and you've seen somewhat in the documentary, and you've also, if you've read the recommended readings by Dr. Longley, you will recognize the fact that the Vietnamese have been under the thumb of colonization for a very, very long time, well before the French even decided in the 1600s to make its way to Southeast Asia. And obviously that colonization came at the hands of the Chinese. So the Vietnamese had a long-term understanding of how to respond to colonization. But it doesn't always work out for them, right? Because they were colonized, and they were colonized, then they were let go, and then they were colonized again by the Chinese. And so the Vietnamese have a particular response, but it's not always a successful response to the idea of colonization. And so after 1885, when the French fully colonized the area and created those 3 separate colonies, you'll recognize the fact that as you look through the book, there are some discrepancies in terms of how each individual Vietnamese person will respond to the colonization of the period. And so that has to do with the fact that there are a few different waves of Vietnamese response, and within those waves of response, there are also many different ideas or sort of ideas that are at opposite ends of each other, at opposing ends, right? So in terms of just prior to 1900, and especially right after they were fully colonized by the French, you see this notion of appeasement versus violent resistance. This is the era in which guerrilla warfare actually begins in Vietnam, or the usage of guerrilla warfare in order to throw off the yoke of colonization, and that obviously is a part of the violent resistance. But there are a lot of people in Vietnam, mainly in the countryside, the peasantry, who thought a lot about the idea of appeasement. Maybe if we just appeased the French, then maybe they would, even though they're going to colonize us, maybe they'll just leave us alone on a daily basis. And so that's what many within the peasantry wanted. Now, in terms of appeasement, you also had some elites that were quite interested in that. And the reason for that is they kind of wanted to ride out the storm. But there are also elites, and by elites in this portion of time we're talking about intellectual elites. There are a great number of them who turn to violent resistance. And this is where we see this idea, and you can actually trace it all the way back to early Chinese colonization with the Trung sisters. But you also see, in terms of just flashing over this period of time where the Vietnamese are colonized by the Chinese, that you'll see little pockets of violent resistance. And so you're going to see this again once 1885 rolls around, and even right before, between like the 1850s and the 1880s, when the French were trying to colonize Vietnam. So here we have these 2 opposing arguments, right? Well, that's not going to change in terms of the next wave of Vietnamese response. And that next wave is, again, there are a great deal of intellectuals who are a part of this movement. And there's this idea on both sides, even in terms of appeasement, that really there needs to be this incorporation of Western ideas. Not only do the Vietnamese feel as though this would be an infusion of new ideas in terms of they hadn't been able to, for a very long time, throw off the yoke of Chinese colonization. And so they're thinking, maybe we need to incorporate some of these Western ideas. And so it's incorporated in terms of appeasement, and it's also incorporated in terms of the violent resistance as well. So throughout these different responses post-1900, you're going to see ideas of resistance and also compliance with what's going on. You're also, and this is a very important point in terms of Ho Chi Minh when we get to him, the idea that Western institutions are going to become extremely important in terms of both appeasement and also violent resistance. The idea that you can institute democratic ideals, whether you're for violence or whether you're for appeasement. And the Modernization Society is a group that was created in 1904, and they believed in this idea of all should violently resist, but they also believed in the idea of creating a Vietnam that was in the image of the United States, and we're going to see this with Ho Chi Minh as well. Now, there are others who didn't believe in the violent resistance as well during this period, and those are the people who are saying to the French, why don't you just, quote unquote, civilize us? Do whatever it is that you want to do with us and then withdraw. You can still have access to the natural resources, but other than that, can you leave us alone? Okay? And so it's really an interesting period of time where, again, you have this split in terms of how people are viewing the idea of resistance, but you're also seeing this enveloping on both sides of Western ideals. And so that's extremely important, as I mentioned, I'm sorry for the typo here, that it leads to how Ho Chi Minh wants to deal with the French and then eventually wants to deal with the United States. So very quickly here's a very short bio on Ho Chi Minh. And two things really to focus on in terms of Ho Chi Minh was the fact that he was a member of the elite class, so he was an intellectual. His father gave him a fantastic education, not only in Vietnam in terms of a French colonial education, but also he was able to travel outside of Vietnam, and he went to Europe, he came to the United States. He was very much enthralled with the idea of the United States and democracy. And then he eventually moves to France and he becomes a cook. And so the point of looking at Ho Chi Minh is to not only see how he connects to those prior resistance movements that we were talking about, but to also recognize the fact that he clearly is someone who takes this idea of westernized ideas and ideals and runs with them. And he has a vast number of ideological influences from the West, particularly the United States, and I have them listed here in terms of self-determination. That would be something connected to the United States, and socialism, which would be something that would be connected with Western Europe. The idea of communism is sort of floating around in his head at this point, and again, this is because of the fact that he is highly educated. The point of bringing this up is that eventually, as we see Ho Chi Minh radicalize, we'll see him move away from the idea of self-determination, and I'll talk to you in a little bit as to why he moves away from that idea of, oh, people are going to allow us this self-determination, and starts to move much more toward communism. So he moves away from the idea of having a democracy. He still believes in the idea of self-determination, but he believes in it in a very different way, and that's through, obviously, the idea of a communal society, and that's the society that he wants to impress upon Vietnam. That's going to go very well in the North. It obviously is not going to go very well in the South. But recognize the fact that he is not only an intellectual, he's not only an elite member of the Vietnamese society, but he also is somebody who has some pretty significant ideological influences, and you're going to see that morph and develop over time. So we're somewhat skipping over World War II here, and I think that's covered pretty well in Karnow and in the documentary. But obviously, as you know by this point, if you're listening to this at the end of your studies for the week, that the period of time that World War II was going on, Southeast Asia was a huge part of that war, and it certainly was because of the fact that Japan was trying to carve out that area of the world for itself. So the idea for the Japanese was really to get Southeast Asia in terms of not just the fact that they were a common people, quote unquote, but that also Japan wanted as part of its, imperial jewel, a place like, say, Vietnam or other areas in Southeast Asia that had significant natural resources. The exact same reason why the French decided to fully colonize it, and the exact same reason why the United States is going to continue to find it very important in terms of geopolitical issues, right? So in terms of the World War II, just remember the fact that the Vietnamese have been sort of colonized again by Japan, and it's not what the Japanese are telling them. The Japanese are telling them that they're going to help them with the idea of self-determination and all of that, but what ends up really being the plan is just full-on colonization of the region by Japan. So Japan's not really any different to them than the west of the world. So skipping over World War II, recognize that really what's going to lead us to the First Indochina War is the fact that the Vietnamese were promised certain things after the war. They were promised by the United States that once the Japanese had been pushed out of Southeast Asia, that they, as the Vietnamese people, were going to have this right to self-determination as discussed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time. So for the Vietnamese, what's going to end up happening is that the United States is going to renege on many of their promises. The French are going to be quite happy that the United States is reneging on many of their promises, and the French are going to be able to keep Vietnam. And so this is clearly a period of time for the Vietnamese where they feel like they're getting ready to throw off the yoke of colonialism, French colonialism. They're able to push out, obviously along with the help of the United States, which is now a superpower, to push out the Japanese. And they have this idea in their heads, particularly because Ho Chi Minh keeps telling them this, that the United States is going to allow them the right to self-determination, and that they're going to be able to create a republic, and they are going to be able to create that republic in the image of the United States with all of its democratic and representative institutions. So when that doesn't happen, we see the August Revolution happen, which is eventually going to lead us into the French Indochina War. So remember the fact that for Ho Chi Minh, initially what he wants is a republic. He wants it to be in the image of the United States. He creates this broad base of support, which is going to eventually help him later on as well. Some people are going to drop away, but other people are going to, he's going to have really the totality of the peasantry, right? He's also going to have some elites, not a great deal of them certainly in the South, but some of the few elites in the North with him as well. So this broader base that he's able to create for himself in this point in time, a great deal of those people are going to stick with him. So again, I stress the point of republic, 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 okay? So in the image, in many ways, of the United States. He wants this to be a nationalist republic. He wants this to be something where the people of Vietnam see themselves not only as living in a nation, but devoting themselves to the nation. He appeals to all classes in terms of this, in terms of being a part of the republic, and that means even the elites to him, and even those elites that have been collaborators with France. He wants to envelop everyone into this republic. And again, as you can see here, there are representative bodies that he wants to create. He wants there to be universal suffrage, and on and on and on, okay? Representing the will of the people. Sounds a lot like the United States, right? So in terms of being able to create for himself most people would call it an illusion. I actually truly believe that at this point in time, from all of the books that I've read about Ho Chi Minh, the idea that he absolutely wanted the United States or Vietnam to be in the United States image. He still had ideas of socialism and communism floating around in his head, as I have here is a wide spectrum of political ideologies that he adheres to, but the bulk of this republic, it's called a republic, is supposed to be like the United States. Representation. Everybody gets to vote. Having a government in which all people are represented and all people have a say, right? So it's very much like the United States. And we're going to see that, unfortunately, as I mentioned, fall apart for him, not through anything in terms of his own doing, but because of the international players around him not accepting this idea for Vietnam, and they don't accept it for many reasons, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So one of the greatest mistakes that Ho Chi Minh makes in this period, right after World War II ends, is that he has this belief that the United States is going to help him in terms of creating the Republic of Vietnam. And he believes this because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and some of the things that he said. And he also believes it in terms of his own personal understandings and belief in the Republic of the United States. And so he really is sort of taken in by democratic ideals and how the United States has worked for, at that point, as long as it had. And so he really, for lack of a better phrase, bought into the idea of the American democracy, the American Republic, representative democracy, and he really believed that the United States wanted to help him. And what he's going to get swept up in is he's going to get swept up into the international system and the uncertainty of the international system after World War II. Not only everyone looking backwards and saying we can never have what happened with Hitler happen again, but also in terms of being swept up in the present, and that being concerns over the Soviet Union and the influence that the Soviet Union wanted in the world, and what that would mean for the United States, because we're looking at a bipolar system at this point with only the United States and the USSR at its head. And so Ho Chi Minh gets swept up in all of this. All of these concerns that the United States has about the Soviet Union, about retaining its own power that it just gained. And it's not FDR, but Harry S. Truman that makes sure that Vietnam does not become a republic in terms of the United States' influence on the situation. Because Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies before any of this is even remotely hammered out. But FDR had started to think a little bit differently about it too, because he was starting to see what he felt were the realities of the international system, and he knew that he was going to have a difficult time with Stalin. And he had a good understanding that even though he believed in self-determination for all peoples, that according to him and to people around him, there were some peoples within the world that needed a great deal of help with the idea of self-determination, if that makes any sense, right? How can you be self-determined if someone else is assisting you in trying to figure out or even telling you what you're self-determined to be, okay? So it's FDR and it's Truman that Ho Chi Minh was going to look to. And when things didn't pan out for him in terms of the United States helping him and helping him to build the Republic of Vietnam, that's when Ho Chi Minh starts to let go of some of the American underpinnings of his understanding of what he wanted the Republic of Vietnam to be. And this is when he starts to move a little bit closer into communism, and it's also when he's actually forced to start, if he wants any sort of financial assistance or any military assistance and a variety of methods of assistance, that he's going to have to look to places like China and the USSR. And so at this point in time, this is where you see Ho Chi Minh break in terms of his understandings of how he wants to see Vietnam in the image of the United States. This also is a point in time where you see Ho Chi Minh start to look at every single issue that came upon him and figure out how he could play one side off of the other. And he does this a lot with the United States and the USSR until we get to the full-blown Vietnam conflict with the United States. He also, in the back of his head, is trying to please everyone too. So it's not just this sort of negative understanding of how he's trying to manipulate the system. But he's also trying to please everyone to see who he can actually get stuff from in order to make sure that the Republic of Vietnam, or some semblance thereof, is actually created. But all of this really falls through for him, and the agreement that he had hammered out with the French, it falls apart too. And that agreement was really just going to be, you recognize the fact that we're a republic, we'll allow you to stay here militarily for a while and even allow you to have some of the natural resources, but eventually you have to leave. And this agreement falls apart because of the fact that the United States starts to exert pressure, and the French is very happy with the pressure that the United States is exerting, because it means that they're going to be able to keep Vietnam as a colony. And of course that does not sit well with Ho Chi Minh. So another significant topic to keep in mind as you're rolling through all of this information is to really recognize the fact that the United States, the importance of Vietnam to the United States became greater and greater as the 20th century rolled along. So in terms of the early 1900s, it's relatively unimportant, and the United States only sort of dabbles in trade with Vietnam, and there's really nothing that's holding the United States to any sort of position on Vietnam and what's going on in Vietnam in terms of the French having colonized the region. Now, in terms of the 1920s and the 1930s, Southeast Asia on a whole is going to actually be very, very important in terms of the natural resource of rubber, as I was talking about before. Also, tin is going to be an issue, and oil as well. But as you see here in terms of the statistics I have, over 90% of the crude rubber used by the United States in the 1920s and the 1930s, for particularly car tires, was coming from Vietnam. And so, of course, Vietnam is going to become a much more important aspect of the world to the United States. And the main issue here in terms of it becoming so important is that, as I had mentioned before, we always think of it being a geopolitical issue, right? We always see it as being something that's connected to the Cold War, that the United States wants to make sure that France or itself has some sort of control over the region. And of course, as I mentioned before, that is a significant part of it. But the economics cannot be downplayed here, and particularly in terms of the issue of rubber. Oil is not as in as much supply in Vietnam as rubber, and so rubber is the main issue. But oil, in the United States or any Western nation, especially in this period, is really going to be interested in anywhere they can get oil. Right? It's still something that's in terms of how we view our world is still important. Internationally, it's important not only in terms of economics, but it's also important in terms of who are our allies and who we try to keep as our allies and who we don't want to make angry in terms of the international system, right? So we really see in the 1920s and the 1930s that cars in particular, or industrialization in particular, because the oil is also used in terms of factories. Eventually, we're going to see this in terms of airplanes, in terms of aircraft, that oil is going to be something that really blossoms in terms of its importance in the international system. And so this is obviously, along with rubber, going to make Southeast Asia on a whole really important economically. So it's going to be on the radar screen of the United States well before we get into the Cold War. It also is a significant issue in the 20s and the 30s because it puts them in the imperial race with the Japanese, and the Imperial Japan is really quite interested in expanding its influence at this point, not only for the creation of an economic empire, but also a political empire in terms of the international system. So the United States is going to be in a race with Japan, and this obviously all ties into World War II. And so for the Vietnamese, they're getting pulled into these problems in the international system well before we talk about them having been pulled into it, right, in terms of the Cold War. They're being pulled into the international system, and all of the problems and issues that the major players within the international system are having. Say again here, the example of the United States and the Japanese. The Vietnamese are getting pulled into all of this. And as the Cold War starts to develop after World War II, we're really going to see the Vietnamese people just caught up in this whirlwind, right? So let's move along and let's think a little bit more about how Vietnam becomes important for the United States. So as mentioned, economics played a huge role in the United States wanting to maintain Western control over Vietnam. But the other issue, and I mentioned it as being the issue that is often the most talked about and the most studied, and that is the Cold War. And so obviously after World War II, the United States sees itself sitting at the top of the heap in terms of the international system, and it becomes a bipolar system. There are only two major players, the United States and the USSR, and never the twain shall meet, right? That these two powers are on the polar opposite in terms of what they see ideologically, what they think about the world, and how they view the world. And so at this point in time, Vietnam is going to become a pawn, and that's the pawn that we talk about in terms of the Vietnam conflict with the United States. And the United States really at this point in time it's been developing as a major power in the international system for quite a few decades, but at this point obviously it has burst onto the scene as the only player of the West, right? Western Europe is still reeling from World War II, and the United States obviously came out on top in terms of the notion that it saved Europe and saved that portion of the world. In Western Europe, the idea that the United States had really been their personal saviors, you know, the liberation of France, making sure that Great Britain didn't fall to Hitler. And so the United States has a great deal of power. And so what the United States decides to do, at least in this point in time, is to allow France to maintain Vietnam as a colony. And again, this is not what Ho Chi Minh thought that the United States was going to do, not just in terms of the fact that the United States had sort of alluded to this, particularly Roosevelt, but because he believed in these democratic institutions and ideals and the idea that the United States would want them to have their right to self-determination. So this is a significant blow, as I mentioned before, to Ho Chi Minh. And this is something that develops over time, the United States sort of relinquishing its position in terms of Vietnam becoming a republic and Vietnam becoming free. And initially it was Roosevelt who started thinking like, oh, you know, we don't necessarily want colonization and colonialism to stay in place in terms of Southeast Asia, but we also know that we have a nice little economic jewel here, and oh, by the way, now we have to worry about Stalin because we're worried about international communism. And why are we worried about international communism in that portion of the world? It's because of the fall of China, right? The idea that China is obviously extremely close to Vietnam, and China has already colonized Vietnam before. So it's a consistent concern over the issue of international communism, not just a concern regarding the Soviet Union, right? So as the Roosevelt administration starts thinking about this, FDR dies. And so it's left to Harry S. Truman to decide what to do with Vietnam. And let me tell you, Harry S. Truman did not think the same way that FDR did in terms of self-determination, and very much immediately decided that not only should the United States look at maintaining the colonial presence there in Vietnam, but that it should also have a much larger but behind the scenes role in Vietnam. So initially it was looking like there would be a republic, and then it looked like there would be like an international trusteeship that was going to oversee Vietnam, and then eventually there would be a republic. And the United States government, and particularly the Truman administration, they renege on this. And so there's really a great deal of concern on the side of the Vietnamese as to what this means for them. Will the French ever really leave? You know, we thought we were at this point where we were creating this agreement that France would stay for a little while longer militarily. We'd give them consistent access to us economically in terms of natural resources, but eventually that they were going to go away. And the way that they were going to go away was by the Vietnamese slowly creating this republic. And the United States puts an absolute halt to that. And this is again where, as I mentioned before, where Ho Chi Minh begins to change in terms of what ideologies are at the forefront of his message to his people. So let's take a look at the Cold War via the perspectives of the West, and particularly Western Europe and the United States, as having very separate concerns in terms of the Cold War. In Western Europe, they're trying very hard to protect their national security, obviously fresh off the heels of World War II. They are significantly concerned about Stalin being very much like Hitler, and moving across the continent and taking over. They don't have that larger concern that the United States has about the atomic bomb. They don't have concerns over nuclear issues at this point in time. And the United States by 1949 will have a significant concern on their hands, because that is when the Soviet Union is able to successfully use their first atomic bomb. And so for Western Europe, it really is about, you know, staying in that mindset of let's never let something like Hitler happen again, right? Let's never appease a leader. Let's never give in, and let's never let a leader of another nation and another country take us over. And so that's their concern, and that's what they're also rebuilding themselves from World War II. So that's how they perceive the Cold War. They're really concerned about the fact that the USSR seems to be in cahoots with Eastern Europe, and that obviously is bringing Stalin closer and closer to them. And so they're obviously rightfully concerned about that. For all of the West, the greater concern would be the fact that China was lost to communism. And so here's another, you know, a major grouping of people who have turned toward communism. That is really going to be what pushes the Cold War into Southeast Asia. It really is why the wheels start turning in terms of the French, and in terms of the United States, and in terms, in some ways, for the British, that somehow Southeast Asia is going to become this hotbed for communism. One of the reasons why they think this has to do with a lot of the revolutionary movements, but they're really they're comparing apples and oranges, right? The idea that you are practicing your right to self-determination, that you're rebelling against colonization, that somehow that's going to push you into the column of communism, is obviously not true, right? But the larger concern that the United States and Western Europe had was that somehow these peoples who were trying to create their own nations and to use their right to self-determination, that somehow they were too weak or too simple-minded to be able to do it on their own, and that somehow they would fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. And obviously it has a great deal of racial connotations to it, right? So that's one of the major issues that the United States and the West have, is that, you know, throughout the Cold War, They're consistently thinking about how Stalin is going to react to people that they find inferior to them. Okay, and that's something to really think about as we move through the entire conflict, whether it's in terms of the French or in terms of the United States, that there is this air of superiority or this idea that somehow the Vietnamese people are inferior to them and really don't have a right to self-determination in their eyes. Okay, so that's something to think about as you move through the course and to be really hyper aware of. Okay. Also, the idea here is that, you know, international communism is on the move. Now it's got China. It's going to just keep spreading. It's going to go into Western Europe. It's going to spread from Western Europe. Now it's going to spread from China into Southeast Asia and on and on and on and on. Okay. So for the United States, they have a lot of these ideas running through their heads as well in terms of the government, and particularly this idea of you know, do the people of Southeast Asia have the ability to create their own nations and their own republics and to be independent from the West? But they also are, as I said, the leader of the free world. So the President of the United States at the time, Harry S. Truman, has a great deal of weight on his shoulders in terms of being concerned and understanding the concerns of Western Europe, that Stalin is going to become the next Hitler, right? And as Stalin moves into areas in Eastern Europe, Truman creates the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine basically is that the United States will help to defend any country that is being subjugated by the USSR. And so this doctrine is going to carry us through the entirety of the Vietnam War. And this doctrine is what gets the United States in more and more trouble throughout the world during the period of the Cold War, because of the fact that everywhere the United States looks, it thinks it sees a new Soviet satellite. And sometimes they are Soviet satellites and sometimes they aren't Soviet satellites. But they always treat it as such, right? That it's always a satellite of the Soviet Union. Whenever you see communism or a version of socialism in an area, that somehow they're being converted to the Soviet style of communism. And so that's something that the United States fights against and fights against. Okay. Then also the United States has that very valid concern about nuclear war. So the United States is really quite concerned about a multitude of issues, and rightfully so, considering the fact that it now leads the West and is only one of two major powers in the entire world. So the United States really has a great deal of weight on its shoulders, but often it transfers that weight in a way that really not only harms in smaller groupings of individuals, or in groupings of individuals that don't have as much power, say like the Vietnamese, and it also gets them in a great deal of trouble in terms of kind of seeing threats that may not always be there. And again, I won't necessarily say that 100% in terms of Vietnam, because Ho Chi Minh always had communist tendencies, and as we see him move through the war with the French and then eventually through the conflict with the United States, that you can see him becoming more and more radicalized toward communism. So I'm not suggesting that he was not a communist, but I am suggesting that the United States and the West often saw threats that maybe necessarily weren't there, especially in areas like Latin America and other places in Southeast Asia. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the United States has a pretty significant concern about the spread of international communism, and that's what the Domino Theory is about. The Domino Theory basically says that as one nation or as one country or as one group of people fall to communism, the next one will, and the next one will, and the next one will. Basically the adjoining groupings of people, right, whether they're nations or countries or smaller bands of people, that they will continue, the dominoes will continue to fall, right, one after another until we have widespread international communism. And so the Domino Theory really is something that the Truman administration runs with, and subsequent administrations run with. The man who actually created the Domino Theory George Kennan actually decided multiple years later that he did not believe in the domino theory anymore, but it was already well solidified in terms of United States foreign policy. So the United States has this immense fear of the dominoes falling, and in Southeast Asia this is something that has considerable, it creates considerable alarm for the United States because of the fact that they not only have the Soviet Union that they're worried about dabbling in Southeast Asia, or that they have created some sort of satellite in terms of North Vietnam, but also we see that they have the significant concern of neighboring China, right? But as I explained in the previous slide, and I kind of want to hammer this point home here, is the idea that the United States has a lot of stuff going on in its head during the Cold War. So the Cold War is not just about the bomb. The Cold War is not just about the spread of international communism. The Cold War is about a lot of things for the United States. It's about a clash of political ideologies. It's about maintaining its own power in the international system, this newfound significant power. It's all about economics and trade, too. So in terms of Vietnam, like I mentioned, rubber and oil, this obviously envelops itself into the Cold War. This is a reason why the United States wants to hold on to, at least in terms of Western possession, Vietnam. And they don't want Vietnam eventually to become independent because of these economic reasons as well, so natural resources. And then also for the totality of the West, it's this concern about the rise of totalitarianism. And for the United States, the reason why it's concerned about it is obviously it would be the one to defend Western Europe against it. And this was something that the United States knew that they could not get into a major military event, especially one that rivaled World War II. They could not get into that so close to World War II, because as much as World War II allowed for the United States to augment its power and to augment its military, it also needed to recover financially too, right? It also needed to recover in terms of the number of young men that it needed to generate in order to fight a war like that. But it's also for the rest of Western Europe, this idea that they're right there. They're right there in the thick of it, and they are scared to death that Stalin's going to turn into Hitler. So the United States, as now being the leader of the free world, has to take those concerns into consideration as well. So it's not just about what that type of a war would mean for them. It's also about the fact that they really need to be protective of the West. So many of these things you're going to see them rear their ugly head in the first Indochina War, and then you're certainly going to see all of them rear their heads in the Vietnam conflict. And so as we kind of move through all of this, keep in mind what the Cold War really is about for the United States. That it's not always about the bomb, that it's not always about the spread of international communism, but it can be about a plethora of things, and it can be about the enormous amount of pressure that the United States is under economically and in terms of the international political system. So we're going to quickly fly through the First Indochina War in these next 3 slides. And these are really the brass tacks here, the things that I think you should really take away from studying and particularly in watching the documentary when we go into such depth about the war. I know a lot of people, some of you don't, obviously, and some of you love the detail, but many of you get really bogged down in it, or even the wars themselves become boring when it becomes like a blow by blow, right? And when it becomes boring, it becomes really difficult, or when you become overwhelmed by all the details, it really becomes difficult to figure out, what's going on and why this is important and why that's not important. So I really wanted to boil it down to brass tacks for you. So here it is in terms of the strategies. Initially, the strategy for the Vietnamese is going to be that they really want to spread the French thin. They want to make sure that since the French have only a limited number of troops in the area and a limited number of supplies and a limited amount of equipment, that they're going to push the French out across the countryside, and they're going to make sure that they are spread out so thin that they can create not only a war in which the French have limited access to the things that they need, but also that the Viet Minh can create a protracted war, much like we talk about in United States military history, the protracted war that the South wanted in terms of the Civil War, because they felt that they could wear out the Union. And this is the same thing that the Viet Minh talk about, and this is obviously a pretty major military strategy for the West, this idea that you would have protracted war. So the Viet Minh appropriate that idea, and they really want to spread the French thin, make sure that they don't have as much access to all of the things that they need, since they clearly are fish out of water anyway, right? So the idea here is to wear them out, wear them out, wear them out. And quite honestly, that I said that was their initial strategy. That was their whole strategy, because that's what they did, right? They definitely wore out the French. The French started out with the idea of having a very limited strategy, and that strategy would be that they would not get themselves spread out very thin, and that they would make sure that they also were not sending in too much equipment and too many troops, and just trying very hard to make sure that they would not go full force against the Vietnamese. They wanted to pick a very particular place to set up shop and to maintain for themselves a strategic foothold. They decided that they would do that in terms of the lowlands, and that's very important in terms of the people that they believed were on their side, and that's obviously the people of the South and the people who were collaborators and who were part of the economic elite in South Vietnam. So the idea was to create a very particular place where they had a vast number of friendly people there, people who are not their enemies, and that they could have a very strong strategic foothold there. They also were trying very hard to use the South as a place where they could stop any new recruits, or even really in the middle regions of Vietnam, make sure that the North could not get a hold of new recruits, and could also not feed themselves, because they wanted to cut off the supply of rice. All of this does not work. And there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't work. Number one, because the Viet Minh, and we'll see this in the Vietnam conflict, the Viet Minh is very, very resourceful. So the people of North Vietnam, most of these people who were fighting with Ho Chi Minh are peasants, and they live off the countryside. They know how to get around the countryside, and they know how to live off of this land. And so a lot of these things that the French are trying to do in order to thwart the Viet Minh they're not going to work. So they move beyond this limited strategy, and they move to sort of fanning out a little bit more, and they move to getting indirect assistance from the United States. And that's where the United States starts getting itself embroiled in this region in a way that is going to eventually allow for the occurrence of the Vietnam conflict. And that's anything you take out of the French Indochina War. It's that the United States is going to be giving aid in a vast amount of ways, and the most important ways being in terms of giving assistance with equipment, and assistance also with strategy, like sending military advisors in order to help, right? And so this is going to get the United States embroiled in this war, but it's also going to get the United States a name for itself in Vietnam, in terms of those people who are not French collaborators. It's going to get a name for the United States, that the United States really is going to have a hard time, and really an impossible time of throwing off of themselves, and that the Viet Minh and the people of the central and the northern countryside are really going to see the United States as having meddled in something that it shouldn't have meddled in. And obviously, if they were going to meddle in all of these issues, what the North particularly wanted the United States to meddle in was getting them their right to self-determination, getting them their republic. And obviously, this doesn't work. So the actual French Indochina War is something that the Vietnamese are able to really get the upper hand in. And initially, when the war starts, it's so the Viet Minh get the upper hand, and then the French kind of get the upper hand, but it's always that the Viet Minh get the upper hand again. And it's at Dien Bien Phu where the Viet Minh are able to get the edge in the war. And so, you could see a slight bit of, like teetering back and forth between who really had the upper hand in the war. But it was clear from the very start that the Viet Minh were going to give the French a run for their money. And it's at Dien Bien Phu where we see the real meat of that. We see the fact that the Vietnamese are able to use tactics, and very new tactics too, in order to thwart the French. And so, I had talked about the fact that they had some pretty good strategy in terms of the fact that they wanted to create a protracted war, and they were really trying to fan out the French. But over time, the Viet Minh also decided that they really needed to employ some pretty significant strategies and tactics in order to come out on top in terms of the war. And so for the North Vietnamese, the idea is that they needed to enlist the help of the people of the Vietnamese countryside. And the way that they needed to enlist them was to find ways in which to thwart in any way possible any cuts to supply lines, any cuts in terms of their ability to get from point A to point B wherever they needed to along the north and the central countryside. And so what happens is that the Viet Minh is able to employ the people of the countryside to help transport military equipment, sometimes secretly, and also to create what are called human anthills. And those anthills are that system of tunnels that the North Vietnamese had to move people particularly and sometimes supplies from point A to point B. And so they had all of these inner tunnels underground where they could go here and go there. And they would build they would take a grouping of people from the countryside and they would build a bridge in a few days across a chasm. Like, they found all of these ways to employ the people of the countryside and to use their numbers and to use their desire for self-determination, or their desire to throw off the yoke of colonization, in order to make things happen, right? And so these new tactics really push them over the edge. And so by the end of Dien Bien Phu, we see that the Vietnamese are the winners. They incur great casualties. But in terms of being able to know how to fight against the colonizer, this is their crowning moment, right? This is this moment where they recognize what it is that they need to do, and they recognize very particularly the weaknesses of the French and the strength of themselves. And the weaknesses of the French are really going to be the fact that they're far, far away from their home base, and the great strengths of the Vietnamese people are the fact that they pull together, right? And you only see in this war, and also in the war with the United States, you only see the elites pulling away, and you don't see all of the elites pulling away. You only see those elites that are so terribly intertwined in the French colonial system. Okay, you only see those people who, they make their bread and butter off of the French, and they want to keep it that way, right? Other than that, you have this vast network of people, including in the South, that are going to help the Viet Minh, that are going to help Ho Chi Minh to recognize his own vision, right? And so this is something that this particular battle is the one that really shows this to the French. And it allows for the Geneva Convention, it allows for the Geneva Accords to be created. But the one major problem with this particular battle and the way that the Vietnamese are fighting is that the United States doesn't pay attention, right? They don't pay attention to how the Vietnamese fought, and they don't pay attention to their strength in numbers, right? And so a lot of the mistakes that the French make, the United States is going to make them as well. So let's talk a little bit about the end of the war and talk about those accords, and then talk about how those go painfully awry for everybody involved. So the Geneva Accords were born out of the Geneva Conference, and I'm sorry, I think I said in the previous slide I called it the Geneva Convention. That's obviously not what I meant, the Geneva Conference. So these accords were born out of this particular conference, and the conference was attended by major groups from the West, the East, and the Third World. And the whole point of this was, even though it was to hammer out the peace of the First Indochina War, it was also a way for all of these groups of people from the international system to get together and to watch this be hammered out. And it seemed like a really good plan, at least in terms of it, somewhat being 50-50, right? Everybody was getting something in terms of the peace of this particular war. And the idea is that there were such divisions at this point between the North and the South. And I mentioned this in terms of the peasantry, even of the south of Vietnam, being connected to the Viet Minh, wanting Ho Chi Minh to be their leader. They weren't very there were many of them in number, but they had very little power. So in looking at Vietnam, what the West did was say, hey, there's a great deal of elite power centered in the South, and that particular power is responsive to us, and we influence them a great deal. That's why we call them the French collaborators, right? Because they're the people who work closely with the French and help the French along in terms of the colonization of Vietnam. So in terms of the West sees, oh, we have a nice concentration of those people in the South. So the totality of Vietnam cannot just be put together in their eyes, right, in the West's eyes. In terms of the northern people and the Viet Minh, and particularly Ho Chi Minh, the idea is that you really don't know what you're talking about here. Like, there are people throughout the southern countryside who want the unification of Vietnam under the ideology, the ideals, the principles, and the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. And we're going to see that obviously with the Viet Cong in the Vietnam conflict. But the major point here for me is that it looked like things were getting hammered out, where one side got one thing they wanted, the other side got something that they wanted, and on and on and on and on. And even though this superficial line of creating North and South was really highly westernized, right, it still was a way to stop the conflict, right? And so the idea here is that the North and the South would eventually be reunified and would become the Republic of Vietnam after the elections were held, that the people from throughout Vietnam who were able to vote, who were able to get to the quote-unquote polls, that they had the say as to whether the country was unified or not. And the West kind of saw the handwriting on the wall in terms of the conference itself when the Viet Minh and when people like Ho Chi Minh were talking to them about, no, we got a lot of people in the southern portion of this country that would be, more than happy to get rid of the French. And so they didn't take it to heart when they were fighting, but they took it to heart in terms of the politics. And they believed that if the elections were held, Ho Chi Minh would be the winner. And so, as we see, this is one of the reasons why the Geneva Accords really start to fall apart. So, this particular point in time here, you think that things are being worked out, but in a way, things are really just coming to a head. So over the course of time, as you know, the Geneva Accords start to crumble, and it's mainly centered around this issue of the elections, and that the United States and the French really do not want the elections to be held because they pretty much know that Ho Chi Minh will win the election. So the United States, in the period as we're moving toward the supposed elections, the that period of time, the United States really puts on a full court press here in terms of trying to win over the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese, particularly those in the southern countryside and then those in the north. They spent a great deal of money in the Truman era trying to develop Vietnam in terms of agriculture, to create medical supplies and aid that was used throughout the countryside, was also used in the war beforehand, but was used throughout the countryside. They gave food, they gave clothing. But the big thing that they gave and the thing that they put a lot of money into was the idea of propaganda and dropping pamphlets all through the rural countryside, telling the Vietnamese people in their own language what it is that the United States was doing and what it is that the United States was hoping for the Vietnamese people. And that would be that they were hoping for reunification, but a reunification that everyone could live with. And so they started sending out a great deal of propaganda. Some of it was anti-Ho Chi Minh. Others was just basically saying, you know, the United States, or those people who are influenced by the United States in your country, those are the people who you should throw your weight behind, especially in the election. The United States is obviously practicing state building here. And state building is something that the United States had been dabbling in before this period of time in the 1950s, and it's certainly something that the United States is going to do often in the 20th century and even in the 21st. The French didn't like this. The French didn't like the idea that the Americans were, I wouldn't necessarily say they were meddling, because they wanted help from the Americans, and they wanted help to maintain their ability to be in the region. So they appreciated what the United States was doing, but in many ways they also saw the United States as somewhat overstepping things, crossing a line that would indicate to the French that maybe the United States wanted to be the head honcho in the region. And so that's something that the French were really upset about, and the French obstructed a great deal of what the United States was doing. But in terms of, you know, summarizing all of these things that we've been talking about for this particular portion of the course, recognize this as sort of a breaking point in terms of a relationship between the United States and the French, which is going to continue to get worse and worse, but it's also going to illustrate to the Vietnamese people that the United States, if we didn't think we couldn't trust the United States before, we probably shouldn't in terms of their own understandings of how they wanted their own world to work. They probably shouldn't be trusting the United States anymore, right? And this is where they start getting the idea in their head that maybe those elections aren't going to actually occur, and if they do occur, that the wrong person, like, say, in terms of their minds, Bao Dai is the emperor of Vietnam, is going to be the one who wins. And so, of course, the Vietnam people are a little bit smarter than that, and they recognize the fact that the United States is really meddling in their business too, not just the French's business. And our final content slide here is just discussing in a little bit more depth the U.S. quote-unquote intervention in Vietnam during this period of, you know, supposed calm and relative calm, and what really ended up being like the calm before a new storm, but was really a period of time where the French and the Vietnamese were working toward a particular aim, and that was those elections and the hopeful reunification of Vietnam. And for each side, their hope was that, you know, for the Vietnamese, and for a vast majority, but not all of the Vietnamese people, they had hoped that they would be reunified under Ho Chi Minh. And then for those people who were collaborating with the French, their obvious hope, and the hope of the French and the hope of the United States, was that Bao Dai would be the person who reunified Vietnam. And so again, just a conflict in terms of what everybody wanted. And you know, there's this, I'm not sure if you guys are aware of it. I am, as a historian, that there's a lot of information out there, a lot of older information out there about the idea that the people of Vietnam were split, and they were always split. And yes, the people of the South, the elites of the South, have always been different, but it was the interference of the French in the South that really allowed for there to be these immense amounts of collaborators that would then throw a wrench into everything in terms of reunification. And so it really has a great deal to do, even though there's certainly conflict in terms of the Vietnamese people. That conflict is augmented in terms of what the French did and what the French were trying to do in terms of keeping Vietnam at least in their back pocket, right? Maybe not having full control over Vietnam, but at least having some sort of control, particularly over the resources, and just holding on to a colonial possession, which they were fast losing, right? So in terms of this period of time, you really see that the people involved, just across the board, the people involved are really struggling with this idea of what kind of a republic is Vietnam, what kind of a country should Vietnam be, and the West is really projecting a great deal on particularly the South, that there's some sort of an inherent divide between the North and the South. And there is, again, like I mentioned, some divide there. But a vast majority of that divide was influenced by French colonization. So that's something to really not be ignored. In terms of the United States in this period, you really see that the United States, and this is the post French Indochina War, and that period where the Accords are supposed to be working, that the United States really steps up what it's doing in Vietnam, and that it starts giving more military assistance, it starts giving more in terms of training, it starts giving more money, it helps them to devise any sort of military strategy, and the hope is that the French and the Vietnamese, when the elections don't go down, that the French and the Vietnamese would be able to thwart any sort of attacks from the North. And obviously they're never strong enough to do that, and in terms of the Vietnam conflict itself, they're never strong enough to do that as well. But the United States starts talking about the idea of direct intervention, putting troops on the ground, or at least in terms of the air, that the United States is talking about using aircraft and dropping bombs. And this direct intervention is something that the Eisenhower administration talks a great deal about, but they don't do it. Congress doesn't want it, and there's just this consistent concern, even though the United States is starting to play the role of the world's policeman, that the United States just really doesn't want to get directly involved, and it doesn't want public recognition of its involvement in terms of the French Indochina War, the peace of the French Indochina War, the crumbling of the peace of the French Indochina War, and then whatever is going to come after it. Because obviously we're looking at all of this in hindsight. They don't know what's going to happen to Vietnam, especially even though they're working very hard to have Bao Dai as the unifier of Vietnam. They don't really know what's going to happen, especially after they halt the elections. They don't know how the Viet Minh are going to take it. They don't know how Ho Chi Minh's going to take it, and they really know that they're sitting on a powder keg. So here are your major takeaways from this portion of the course, and recognize that we've gone all the way back to Chinese colonization in our readings and in the documentary, and we have pushed ourselves all the way into the middle of the 1950s. Okay, so we have a lot here that we need to remember and we need to understand. Starting from the point of French colonization, I want you to recognize and remember how the Vietnamese responded. Remember the idea of what type of resistance there should be, right? Should it be passive? Should it be a type of appeasing sort of resistance, somewhat enveloping yourself in a French culture, but also resisting in other ways? Or are you going to have violent revolution? And so this is something that is consistently talked about and people struggle with, and they move from side to side on it, right? So if you know anything about the point of French colonization, understand the fact that as the Vietnamese are navigating this colonization, that is when they start thinking about how they're going to have their own independence, and if they're not allowed that independence, how they're going to create it for themselves militarily, right? And this is something, again, that unfortunately they have to use time and time again. And so for them, this is a portion in time where, the early 1900s or just prior to 1900, that they're thinking about how to continue to resist in the way that they did with the Chinese. So how are they going to resist? What are they going to do? This is a very important point in time because obviously this is where Ho Chi Minh is coming of age, and Ho Chi Minh is learning what it is what ideologies that he's going to use. Recognize the fact that the Vietnamese had a significant desire for self-determination. It was the West's desire to prevent that self-determination for a lot of reasons, but namely the Cold War, right? But that the Vietnamese really, and particularly Ho Chi Minh, had initially wanted the Republic of Vietnam to be in the image of the United States. Also recognized that the First Indochina War was going to illustrate how the next war would go, and the Americans really didn't watch that. And it probably had a great deal to do with the fact that the Americans thought, well, we aren't the French, and we're a little bit more nuanced in terms of our military strategy, and that's not going to happen to us. And obviously it did. It went down the same exact way. Recognize that the Geneva Accords were restrictive to the Vietnamese, but also the fact that the Vietnamese thought, well, this is probably the best that we're going to get, and it looks like it's kind of even. And that the many aspects of the Geneva Accords were never fulfilled because of the fact that the United States and France really didn't want the West to get its claws out of Vietnam, and they were really concerned about what it meant for Vietnam to be this free, independent state out there, with the prospect that the Soviets or even the Chinese would pick them up as a satellite. Also recognize that there are many, many complications in this new bipolar international system, and that all of that stuff is going to come up within the wars too. That the United States does and doesn't get into the initial conflict, and then does and then pulls out of the eventual conflict that it has with Vietnam and with the Vietnamese of the North. That for them, for the United States that is, that there are many complications in their choices. That being the leader of the free world, being a new leader of the free world, having to worry about the Soviet Union, having to worry about China, wanting to have the West involved in Southeast Asia, wanting access to natural resources. That's just over and over and over and over again. There are all of these complications that really cloud how the United States judges what it's going to do in Vietnam, and then also really harms in many ways how the United States is going to handle the war. And that is the next war, not the French Indochina War. And then finally, that the United States had been meddling in Southeast Asia for years before the Vietnam War. So the United States had sort of been putting a toe in the water for a very long time, and we talked about that in terms of the early 20th century, and then that just ramps up in terms of economics, and then eventually in terms of the United States being, the top of the heap in terms of the international system. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful in terms of sort of boiling down things to brass tacks, and you have one of these for each individual section of the course, so hopefully they're helpful to you. Take care.